I'm Tony Bach. I'm a medical oncologist and palliative care physician in Seattle. And I'm both a provider and a little bit of a tracker. I'm in a study where I'm having my fitness, blood, microbiome, genome all tracked. And so I see this kind of from both sides. My collaborator, Gina Neff, is a sociologist who's been studying the e-patient space for some years. One of the reasons we wanted to collaborate on this talk was to talk about this growing disconnect that we're seeing in this world of e-patients and doctors. And here's an example, right? I was at South by Southwest, a panel about tracking. This guy stands up and says, my doctor is a great guy, but he just doesn't have that much data, right? How many of you have heard something like this? Yeah. Contrast this comment to a doctor in one of Gina's studies who said, I don't need more data, I need more resources, right? This is the challenge, this growing disconnect that we are seeing over the notion of data. What is it good for? When can you use it? What kind of truth does it tell? That's the issue that I'm addressing today. And as a sidebar, this talk is derived from qualitative studies that Gina and I have both done in different spaces involving interviews with physicians, nurses, patients, designers, users, and observation fieldwork in the health technology space, as well as informal discussions at places like this. But just to get back to this disconnect issue, the problem is this. Patients and physicians expect different things of data, right? Gina coined the term data valences to talk about the different expectations that users have for data. It turns out e-patients, doctors, and designers are all doing something different with data. And the problem happens when we assume that data possess some kind of intrinsic meaning, right? So what do I mean by that? Let me illustrate. A couple of weeks ago, I saw a new patient as a second opinion. She was somebody who had been treated with surgery and chemotherapy for GI cancer. Her first CT scan after having all this cancer treatment showed one little dot, right? I don't know if you can even see it. It's right there. She was devastated. She said, this means I have to start all over again, right? She took this dot instantly into a story about my cancer is back, I'm going to need more treatment, my doctor isn't being proactive. I looked at this and realized she hadn't really had a CT scan like this before that went through this part of her chest. I wasn't sure if this is really cancer or not. So in fact, the data weren't a story, right? That's illustration number one. Okay, next. I have another patient named George who has metastatic pancreas cancer. One of the things we track and that he tracks is his blood test tumor marker, which is this test called CA19-9. And these are a bunch of his CA19-9s over a period of weeks. You can tell it's going up. He asked me, at what level does it get when I die, right? His expectation about the data was this marker would rise to a certain level and he would die. Like there was a one-to-one correlation with this. He assumed that this data meant that there was some kind of correlation with objective reality, that the data was an objective reality, right? And it turned out that during this entire period of time, his CT scan didn't change at all. So in fact, this data wasn't something about an objective reality. Third illustration. This is from one of Gina's studies. And if one of you are a designer out there, could you please help us with this EMR and this way of looking at blood pressures? The doctor said, you know what, I know what it means, and I know what to do when I have 2 blood pressures taken in clinic over a 6-month period, right? I know that means I need to jump into action. I need to treat this person, right? The doctor went on to say, I don't know what to do when I have 2 elevated readings out of 2,000, right? Because it turns out we don't know what to do with that. So he was assuming that data meant action. Both the doctor and the tracker were assuming that data meant action. And the reality is, actually, you can take data, you can collect it in a certain way, you can interpret it in a certain kind of context, and it might become actionable, but data by themselves are not action, right? So the point I'm making is data is not a story. Data is not objective reality. Whoops, data is not action. But you can use data to build a story. You can use data to get closer to the reality, and you can use data to create action. But now that I've made data really complicated, you know, maybe a little too complicated, like what could I say now? You know, maybe the real question is, and in a way this is the question the whole conference has been asking, what do e-patients need from physicians, right? I mean, there's been a lot of talk about empathy, about openness, about expertise, and what about that? I mean, maybe the real issue from this talk is, you know, what new roles could physicians take in this world where patients are producing their own data, right? So I have 3 recommendations for providers. One is, remember that you are dealing with multiple data valences, right? If you saw the, you know, beautiful visualization by Doug Cantor, and I'm using this as a gift from him. I mean, this really interesting graph of his insulin weekly total and his running mileage weekly total, that is totally fascinating, right? There is no precedent for this in the world of medicine. If I were his physician, though, I would not be saying to him first thing, this is what I make of that data. I would be saying, what do you want to do with that data? This data has many possible uses, and our discussion would have to define what that data could be used for and how I could contribute to it. I mean, the question for me as a doctor would be, how can I contribute to the data valence that's happening here, right? Second, your new role is about sorting out the valences, right? And I have a failure story of my own to tell here. I had a patient who got treated for this really horrible GI cancer, had this radical surgery, came to see me for the first time, and had a CT scan that showed this. This was part of the report. Thickening, suggestive of local recurrence, right? So that was the report. I gave her the report because actually most of my patients want to see their reports. But then I went to look at the image with the radiologist and look at it with the surgeon, and what we decided was that we should recommend that she have a laparoscopy as the least invasive way of figuring out if this was really a real thing, right? While I was doing that, she was getting massive amounts of email from her entire online support group that said, you need to get this resected immediately, right? So she was kind of in a panic. I did not know enough to negotiate these different valences, right? The valence for me was, it's indeterminate, and the radiologist is trying to tell me with these words that you need to pay attention to this, right? It's an alert for me. She was looking at this data valence, not ever having seen the images, going, oh my God, disaster is happening, and you know, they're not doing anything. So she found another surgeon. The surgeon went into her abdomen. He found no cancer, and she left the hospital with a chronic pain syndrome that has never resolved. She still has it to this day. So, and I think that the issue there is, I mean, who knows what would have happened if I had been more skillful, but I wasn't skillful at negotiating this issue of what are the different data valences here, because clearly this data meant something very different to me than it meant to her. Number 3, multiple data valences reflect different and parallel illness stories. There is not one story. We are always dealing with a multiplicity of stories that overlay on top of each other. And
when I go paint, I'm not sick. I don't feel sick. I'm creating something. And my mind is on my creation, not on being a sick person.
We were married over 30 years ago. Vanessa was an artist. I was a scientist. So we have totally different ways of looking at the world and as a scientist, as I know there's information on the internet, and I went to probably the National Cancer Institute site, and I saw that at that time the survival rate for stage 4 colorectal cancer was not good. It was like 5-year survival rate of 5%.
I admired the way dogs live their lives. And I would do my best to live my life in the same kind of a way. They don't look up things on the internet and scare themselves. And I thought, wow, that's a really practical way to approach the whole thing.
right? So this is how different data valences create different stories, and our patients and their families are living all these stories simultaneously. So we as clinicians, we need to learn to negotiate this, and the issue has become more acute now, right? Because in conclusion, what I'm going to say is technology is now enabling this unprecedented flow of data. That this is data that patients produce, they collect, they curate, they analyze. You know, we as physicians now, I mean, I feel like I'm practicing medicine in a different world with these people, and that my job has completely changed. You know, the exact skills that I would use, I think, are beyond the scope of this talk. But what I'd like to point out is that whatever the repertoire turns out to be that we need, it is going to have to be something that includes a really complex understanding of the ways people construct meaning from data. Thank you.